Super Mario 64 is one of the most iconic and beloved games of all times, and it holds a special place in the hearts of many gamers, myself included. From its innovative gameplay mechanics and charming art style, to its memorable soundtrack and vast worlds to explore, there's no shortage of reasons why this game has stood the test of time. As a longtime fan of Super Mario 64, I've always been fascinated by the technology behind this classic game and how its designers managed to push the limits of what was possible on the Nintendo 64. In this video essay, I'll be taking a closer look at one aspect of Super Mario 64's design, the grass texture. The goal of this is to see how Mario 64 could have looked like if it was developed at the end of the Nintendo 64's life cycle instead of the beginning. I'm going to implement all the techniques that were later found for the Nintendo 64 to update the graphical quality of the grass to that of later titles, while keeping the same art style Mario 64 had, and while staying within the technical restrictions that the Nintendo 64 imposes. So unfortunately, we can't just copy-paste this beautiful Bob on Battlefield remake. By the end, you'll see a gigantic difference, I promise. Mario 64 was a game changer in the world of video games. It was the first 3D platforming game to hit the market, and it was a significant departure from the 2D side-scrolling games that had dominated the industry for years. The game introduced us to a whole new level of immersion, as we were able to explore vast, detailed 3D environments and to interact with objects and characters in ways we never had before. One of the most impressive aspects of Mario 64 was its graphics. For the first time ever, the game developers were able to create a fully realized 3D world that was full of color, detail, and life. The characters were animated with a level of precision and detail that we had never seen before, and the environments were designed with a level of creativity and imagination that was truly breathtaking. It's important to remember that this game was released in 1996, a time when technology was still relatively new, and the hardware limitations were significant. Despite these challenges, the developers of Mario 64 were able to create graphics that were considered groundbreaking at the time. They set a new standard for what was possible in the world of video games and showed us what could be achieved with creativity, innovation, and dedication. Of course, by today's standards, the graphics in Mario 64 might seem a little bit outdated, but it's important to remember the context of the time. The graphics of Mario 64 were a testament to the power of human imagination, and they set the stage for incredible graphics that we see in games today. Without the graphics of Mario 64, we might not have the stunning, lifelike visuals that we see in modern games. Mario 64 walked, so gaming could run. And while it's undeniable that the graphics in Mario 64 were groundbreaking for their time, it's important to note that there were still a few areas where the developers could have pushed the envelope even further. Despite the limitations of the hardware and the techniques that were available to them, there were certain graphical elements that could have been improved upon, and the grass in Mario 64 is the prime example of this. These issues with the grass in Mario 64 highlight the fact that while the game was an incredible achievement for its time, there were still areas where the developers could have done better. In this video essay, we will explore these issues in greater detail and examine what the developers could have done differently to create more convincing grass and a more immersive gaming experience. By looking at these issues through a critical lens, we can gain a better appreciation for the incredible achievements of Mario 64, while also recognizing the areas where there was room for improvement. The jump from 2D to 3D graphics in video games represented a massive technological shift, and it brought with it a host of new challenges for programmers and game designers. One of the most significant challenges was the need to understand 3D mathematics, which is a set of mathematical principles that govern the way that 3D objects are rendered onto a 2D screen. In order to create convincing 3D graphics, programmers needed to understand concepts like perspective, depth, shading. They had to calculate the position and orientation of every object in the game world and then project those objects onto a 2D screen in a way that looked realistic to the player. This required a deep understanding of linear algebra, calculus, and other advanced mathematical concepts. Another challenge that came with the transition to 3D graphics was the need to create textures that could be applied to 3D objects. Textures are 2D images that are applied to the surface of a 2D object, and they can be used to add detail, color, and other visual elements to the object. However, creating textures that look good in a 3D environment required a whole new set of skills and tools that programmers and game designers had to learn and program. Not to mention, in order to display a texture on a 3D object, the game engine had to calculate how the texture would appear when viewed from different angles and under different lighting conditions. This involved a lot of matrix transformations and trigonometric functions, which were used to calculate the position and orientation of the texture on the surface of every object. Finally, there was the issue of lighting in a 3D graphics. In a 2D game, lighting was a relatively simple affair. The game designer simply drew shadows and highlights onto the game's sprites to create the illusion of depth and dimensionality. But in a 3D game, lighting had to be calculated in real time, taking into account the position, orientation, and texture of every object in the game world. This required the use of complex lighting models, such as go-route shading, which would approximate the way that light behaves in a 3D environment. All of these challenges made the transition to 3D graphics a very difficult one for game developers. However, despite the steep learning curve, the benefits of 3D graphics were clear. 3D environments allowed for greater immersion and interactivity, and they paved the way for the types of massive, open-world games that we see today. And even though there were certainly areas where developers could have done better, the fact that they were able to create games like Mario 64 with the technology of their time is a testament to their ingenuity and skill. The transition to 3D graphics in video games was not just a technical challenge though. It also required a whole new art form to be developed: 3D modeling. In order to create convincing 3D environments, game designers had to learn how to create 3D models of objects, characters, and environments, and then render those models in a 3D space that could be displayed on screen. At the time that Mario 64 was developed, 3D modeling tools were still in their infancy, and game developers had to develop their own techniques and tools to create the graphics that they would need. This meant that a lot of trial and error was involved, and game designers had to rely on their own creativity and ingenuity to come up with effective solutions. One of the biggest challenges of 3D modeling was creating models that looked realistic and convincing when viewed from different angles. In a traditional 2D game, objects could be drawn from a single perspective, but in a 3D game, objects had to be rendered in real time from any angle that the player might view them. This meant that game designers had to create models that looked good from any angle, which was no easy task. One of the most challenging aspects of 3D modeling that emerged during the transition to 3D graphics was UV mapping. This technique involves taking a texture and unwrapping it, so to say, onto a 3D model without creating any edges. This process requires a significant amount of mathematical thinking, as artists need to figure out how to efficiently map the textures onto a three-dimensional geometry. UV mapping requires artists to think in terms of mathematical projections and coordinate systems, which can be challenging for those who are not familiar with those concepts. Because UV mapping requires such a high degree of mathematical thinking, it was initially difficult for many artists to learn. However, as the field of 3D graphics has evolved, artists have become more familiar with the concept of UV mapping, and it has become an essential part of the 3D modeling process. Nowadays, most 3D modeling software includes UV mapping tools that make the process a lot easier. But the fundamental principles of UV mapping that were developed by early game developers still underpin this process. Another challenge of 3D modeling was creating models that were efficient in terms of memory and processing power. Because 3D games required the rendering of complex models in real time, developers had to find ways to optimize their model and reduce the number of polygons and textures together with the texture sizes they used without sacrificing too much quality. This required a lot of experimentation and trial and error to find the correct balance. Despite the difficulties involved, game developers were able to create 3D environments that looked incredible for their time. They developed their own techniques and tools, and they pushed the limits of the technology of their time to create games like Mario 64. And even though modern 3D modeling tools are much more advanced, The techniques developed by early game developers are still used today as the basis for many modern 3D modeling techniques. It's amazing how we can play a game for years without really noticing certain details. I, for one, have played Mario 64 countless times without really paying attention to the grass textures. However, now that I have a better understanding of the technological and artistic limitations that game developers faced during the transition to 3D graphics, I've started to notice the little things that were done wrong. The grass is the most emblematic for a lot of things that could have been done better during Mario 64's development. As someone who has always loved Super Mario 64, there's always been something about the grass in the game that has felt off to me. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is, but there's a certain repetitiveness and flatness to it that just doesn't quite look right to me. Of course, it's not terrible by any means, but it's just not as good as it could be. For a long time, I couldn't quite figure out what the issue was, but as I've delved more into the world of game design and graphics programming, I've come to understand what's going on behind the scenes. But, as we'll see, there are ways to work around these limitations and bring the grass in Super Mario 64 up to the level that it deserves. Let's take a closer look at how the grass textures themselves are created and rendered in the game. By examining the underlying mechanics of how the grass is displayed on screen, we can gain a better understanding of what the developers were working with and why certain limitations and compromises had to be made. Additionally, by taking a closer look at the grass textures, we might be able to identify specific areas where improvements could have been made. In the end, the goal is not to criticize the game, but rather to appreciate the tremendous achievements of the developers, while also acknowledging that there's always room for improvement, even in a classic game like Super Mario 64. It's interesting to note that the grass in Mario 64 is composed of just two textures, a 32 by 32 grass texture and a 64 by 32 dirt bath texture that blends the dirt into the grass. This is a remarkably small amount of data, especially when compared to modern games with much larger texture libraries. Rendering a whole scene from just 3072 pixels is pretty neat. Despite this, the developers were able to use these textures to create a convincing grassy environment that added depth and realism to the game. However, upon closer examination, we can see that there are some noticeable limitations to the grass textures. Upon closer inspection, we can also see that there are some UV mapping errors on the dirt path texture. These errors are particularly noticeable around the edges of the path, when the texture appears to be broken or misaligned. This could be the result of the developers using the 3D modeling tools incorrectly, or simply a limitation of the tools themselves. UV mapping, which involves mapping a texture onto a 3D surface, can be difficult and a time-consuming process, and mistakes can easily be made. It's worth noting that the texture mapping technique used in Mario 64 appears to be primarily projection mapping, which involves projecting the texture onto a surface from a specific viewpoint. This can look alright, but it also has its limitations. In some areas, such as the platforms in the Bowser level, it's clear that the textures have been stretched and distorted to fit the geometry of the environment, creating an unnatural appearance. One technique that can help prevent the kind of distortions seen in the textures of the grass and platforms in Mario 64 is called minimum distortion UV unwrapping. This technique involves unwrapping the texture onto a 3D model in a way that minimizes the amount of stretching and distortion in the texture. By using minimum distortion UV unwrapping, developers can ensure that the texture is applied accurately and without unwanted stretching or warping. To demonstrate the techniques I'm talking about going forward, I'm going to be focusing on just this small portion of the game environment. Doing so will allow me to showcase the changes and improvements without having to change the entire level a bunch of times. By honing in on a small portion of the game, I can more easily demonstrate how these improvements can be applied to other parts of the game, giving a sense of how the overall experience might look and feel in the end. The first big improvement I want to talk about is follow active quad mapping. Follow active quad mapping, or FAQ for short, is a type of UV mapping technique that can be used to improve the appearance of textures on 3D models, including the dirt path texture in Mario 64. This technique involves selecting a quad face in a 3D model and using it as a guide for the placement of the texture. The rest of the UVs are then arranged around the active quad to maintain the same scale and proportion, resulting in a texture that appears more consistent and natural. By applying this technique to the dirt path texture in Mario 64, developers could have achieved a more visually pleasing and realistic result, with fewer visible distortions or stretching. As a bonus, this also slightly improves performance, because continuous UV coordinates like this allow for triangle stripping optimizations. Triangle stripping optimizations allow you to fuse two vertices from adjacent triangles, saving you a few bytes of memory and a few data transfers and reads. However, it's worth noting that this technique was not widely used or possibly not even available at the time of Mario 64's development. However, UV mapping is not the only way to improve the texture quality in games. There are various texturing techniques available on the Nintendo 64 that developers could have used to enhance the graphics. These techniques range from simple solutions to more complex and expensive methods. I will tell you a few in order of how much cheaper or more expensive they are going to be. By exploring these techniques, we can gain a better understanding of how the grass in Mario 64 could have been improved. Multi-texture blending is a powerful technique that can greatly enhance the appearance of in-game textures, while also reducing the strain on system resources. Multi-texture blending was actually used to create one of the most memorable parts of the game, the Peach and Bowser painting. The painting is actually made up of two different textures, a texture for Peach and a texture for Bowser. The game blends the Peach and Bowser textures in a way that creates the illusion that the two characters are struggling within the painting. What's impressive about this technique is that it was used to create a dynamic scene using just static textures. The blending is done in such a way that the two characters seem to merge together in a fluid motion. It's not only visually impressive, but it also adds an extra layer of intrigue to the game's storyline. It's a testament to the creativity and technical skill of the developers that they were able to create such an impactful moment using relatively simple techniques. By using Vertex Alpha, a single 32x32 dirt texture can be seamlessly blended into a 32x32 grass texture, effectively removing the visible seams between them. This not only improves the visual quality of the texture, but also saves approximately 33% of texture loading times. By leveraging this technique, game developers can create more immersive and detailed environments without sacrificing performance or visual fidelity. With the new multi-texture blending technique using Vertex Alpha, we can see a significant improvement in the overall look of the grass texture. On the left side of the screen, we can see the old technique, which results in ugly seams and a lack of blending between the 64x32 dirt path texture and the 32x32 grass texture. On the right side, we can see the new technique in action, which eliminates those seams and creates a much smoother and more natural transition between the two textures. Moreover, this technique can be applied using projection mapping, the same technique used by Nintendo throughout the game, making it a prime candidate for implementation. The next technique involves turning the dirt texture into a decal, which allows for a smooth transition between the two textures without cutting any geometry. This technique can also help to eliminate any obvious tiling patterns in the textures. By rendering the decal on top of the grass texture, we can achieve a much more realistic and varied look for the grass. This technique is a bit more expensive than the multi-texture blending, but still more efficient than any other alternative, like the original grass textures. The next technique is the first one that's more expensive than the original texture, and involves using two textures on the dirt. One for the dirt texture, and one for the dirt shape. The dirt is blended using a second shape texture, which allows us to create defined transitions between the dirt and the grass texture without visible seams. Unfortunately, this one can't be done using projection mapping, and we have to put in a little bit of effort to make it look good. Also, this technique is more expensive than the original one, as it requires 2 textures and additional blending calculations, which can negatively impact performance. The extra cost comes mostly from loading the additional textures, not from drawing the surfaces. This means that having this tiny extra cost once is well worth it for the entire level, considering how significant the grass textures are in this level, and how little it costs to actually apply this technique. It is definitely worth the extra effort to make the grass look as good as possible. The higher fidelity techniques ensure that the grass and dirt textures blend smoothly and seamlessly, enhancing the overall visual quality of the level by a lot. The Nintendo 64 had a unique set of texture types that developers could use for their games. These included RGBA 16, which allowed for up to 32 colors per channel to be displayed, and could go up in resolution to 64 by 32. Another texture type was CI4, which only allowed for 16 colors per texture, but used a palette, enabling a wider range of textures with less memory usage, going up to 64 by 64. Similarly, CA8 supported 256 colors per texture, with less memory but the same resolution limit as an RGBA 16, while i4 and i8 used only 16 and 256 intensity values respectively, and were primarily used for simple textures, and they each had a 128 by 64 and a 64 by 64 size limit respectively. With this range of options, game developers had to carefully balance the use of memory and visual fidelity when creating textures for the Nintendo 64. Each type of textures had its own strengths and limitations, and it was up to the developers to decide which texture types would work best for their specific needs. Unfortunately, the Mario 64 team decided to scratch all of that and were limiting themselves to only RGBA 16 textures. Because of that, changing the texture type of the grass can provide a significant visual improvement. There are 2 options available to us. The first being the use of a 64 by 64 color index texture, which will take no additional time to load. The second option is to use a 64 by 64 grayscale texture, and then we color it green and create a lush grass texture. This technique can offer a more realistic grass appearance and can be done at the minimal cost of just 15 microseconds. When it comes to the use of larger textures in Super Mario 64, it's important to note that while the Nintendo 64 hardware was actually capable of handling them, the modeling tools at the time didn't seem to support it. In fact, there is very good evidence that Nintendo actually tried to use a larger texture in the game, but resulted in the now infamous broken smoke texture. This texture looks fine as an intensity alpha texture, but it was interpreted as an RGBA 16 texture, and it ended up getting jumbled up in the final game. Real grass, as we all know and love it, is a complex system of blades, each with its own unique shape and orientation, creating a natural texture that is inherently noisy and grainy. When we observe real grass up close, we can see that no 2 blades are exactly the same, and they are arranged in seemingly random patterns. This complexity is difficult to replicate in a digital environment, especially with the limited resources available in early 3D graphics. However, with the use of clever techniques, it's possible to create realistic and natural looking grass in digital environments, even with limited amount of resources. By studying the characteristics of real grass, we can recreate the texture of grass in a way that is at least a little more convincing to the human eye. One technique we can use to achieve this for the grass texture is to apply multi-texturing, which involves multiplying the texture with itself or with another texture. If we use no other texture, this can be done at no additional cost, and it will give the grass a more natural, noisy and grainy look that is less repetitive. This technique can be particularly effective for grass, as it helps to break up any patterns or uniformity in the texture. By applying this technique, we can make the grass look more lifelike and give the level a greater sense of depth and detail. With these options available, it seems almost negligent not to explore the possibilities of upgrading the texture quality of the grass in Mario 64. By taking the time to implement some of these techniques, we could vastly improve the overall visual quality of the game and maybe even bring it up to early GameCube standards. Another technique for improving the grass texture is to combine it with a noise texture. By layering a color texture with a noise texture, we can add more detail to the grass without losing any color depth. This creates a more natural, varied look that is especially effective for grass. By taking advantage of the Nintendo 64's hardware texture blending capabilities, we can seamlessly combine these two textures and achieve a much more detailed and interesting look for the grass in our level. With this technique, the grass can look like a much better version of the original while still maintaining the same art style as the rest of the game. By using tools and techniques from the later Nintendo 64's life cycle, we can improve upon the original design while staying true to the vision of the developers. Now that we've covered some texturing techniques, let's turn our attention to the lighting. Lighting is one of the most critical components of any 3D game, as it can make the difference between a game looking flat and lifeless or vibrant and dynamic. With early 3D games, especially like Mario 64, developers had to figure out how to work with light in a whole new way. Mario 64's approach to lighting, in particular, was quite unique and had a significant impact on the game's overall look and feel. The lighting in Super Mario 64 is an interesting case. It was designed so that the light source comes from the camera. There's a theory that this was done for depth perception reasons. By having the light source follow the camera, it would make it easier for the player to judge the depth and distance of objects in the game world. This was important in a 3D game like Super Mario 64, where accurate depth perception is crucial for the player to make precise jumps and movements. The camera-based lighting also allowed for a greater sense of immersion, as the lighting on the objects in the game would change as the player moved the camera around. Alternatively, there's a second theory that suggests that the camera-based lighting system was not a deliberate choice, but rather a result of the development team's limited skills and time constraints. This theory is supported by the fact that the camera-based lighting system is highly unconventional and it produces some peculiar visual effects. For example, the lighting appears to come from a single point source, making it look like Lucky 2 is walking around with a flashlight. Furthermore, I've investigated the code for the lighting system, and it contains some highly convoluted matrix math that suggests the developers may have been struggling to implement a more traditional lighting system. Despite these limitations, the camera-based lighting system has become a defining characteristic of the game's unique visual style, and completely removing it would feel very off to us players that are so used to seeing the game like this. However, there are ways to improve the lighting in Mario 64 without having to touch the more complex aspects of the engine. Simply changing the grass can have a big impact on the visuals. One technique involves baking fade lights into the vertex colors of just the grass, which can create the illusion of more detailed lighting without actually having to render any extra lights. This technique can actually be a little less expensive because it saves us from computing lighting in real time, and it can make the grass look a lot better. By taking advantage of this simple technique, developers can improve the lighting in their game without having to dive too deeply into the technical aspects of the engine. In the microcode used in Mario 64, it is not possible to use both real-time lighting and vertex colors simultaneously. This means that with the switch to bake lights for the environment, we have unlocked the ability to use vertex colors for additional detail work. Now, we can use vertex colors to add extra definition to the environment without worrying about performance costs. This allows us to add more nuanced textures to the surfaces and have more complex geometries that add depth and detail to the game world. It's an example of how optimizing one aspect of the game can often lead to unlocking new possibilities in other areas. One vertex coloring technique we can use to improve the appearance of the grass is what I like to call hue transitions. This technique involves blending together different shades of green to create a more natural and organic look for the grass. By using vertex colors, we can create a smooth transition between these different shades of green, which can break up the repetitive appearance of the grass. This technique can be applied at no cost and can greatly improve the overall appearance of the grass. It is a simple yet effective way to add more detail and variation to the grass texture without adding too much complexity to the level design. With the implementation of vertex colors, we can not only break up the repetitiveness of the grass, but we can also utilize grayscale textures for the grass. Compared to color textures, grayscale textures are only half as big, and using them allows us to add more detail to the texture. This is because we can assign different hues to the same grayscale texture, effectively creating multiple textures from just one. This technique is commonly used in game development, particularly for environments like grassy areas where detail and variety are crucial for an immersive experience. And this is what the grass in Mario 64 could have looked like if the game was developed at the end of the Nintendo 64's life cycle. As you can see, it's much more detailed and realistic than the original grass. While the original grass looks flat and repetitive, this new version has depth and texture. It's also much more visually interesting to look at, with the combination of different techniques giving it a unique and varied appearance. The improved graphical fidelity is a testament to the power of evolving rendering techniques and how they can be used to enhance classic games like Super Mario 64. One issue we need to address in optimizing the level is the render order of the grass. Currently, the grass is being rendered first, but this causes a lot of overdraw, which can significantly slow down the rendering process. To improve performance, we need to render the grass last, after all the other objects in the scene have been rendered. This will help reduce overdraw and make the rendering process more efficient. By optimizing the render order, we can ensure the grass never causes any overdraw. Now some of you might be asking, what is overdraw? Let me explain. Overdraw is a term used in computer graphics to describe the process of rendering pixels that will eventually be discarded because they are not visible to the end user. When an object is drawn on top of another, the pixels for the first objects are being overdrawn, so to say, by the pixels of the second object. While some of the earlier techniques may come with a performance cost, this final improvement easily offsets that cost by a factor of 5. Providing a much smoother and more detailed image while increasing the visual fidelity of the game. The combination of these techniques allows for creating more detailed and visually impressive environments in Nintendo 64 games. Now, with every technique applied, I'm pretty happy with the final result. That's just my opinion though. What do you think? Do you agree that the new version is a significant improvement over the original? Or do you prefer the original's simpler, more retro look? It's always interesting to see how different people view the same piece of art. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. Do you think the changes make a significant improvement? Are there any other techniques you would suggest to further enhance the visuals? Ultimately, decision of whether or not these changes are worth the effort is subjective, but it's interesting to consider the possibilities for improving classic games with modern hindsight. By combining various techniques we've discussed, there are endless possibilities for creating unique and detailed visuals in video games. The use of texture blending and UV mapping on surfaces can create more depth and variety, while different texture types and multi-texturing can add more detail to objects and environments. Baking lighting into vertex colors can save on performance cost, while also creating a more consistent look, and the use of hue transitions can break up repetitiveness and add additional visual interests. There are countless other techniques that can be combined or modified to achieve any desired result. Let me know which combination of techniques you would like the most. That concludes my video essay on reworking the grass in Super Mario 64. I hope you found this to be a good background noise during this long talk. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel for more content like this. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn how to program yourself, check out this video's sponsor, Brilliant.org. Brilliant offers amazingly interactive learning tools to get into STEM. It's got thousands of lessons that focus on both introductory and advanced topics, and new lessons are added monthly. If you want to get started on programming, I recommend this Python course here. If you can program in one high-level language, you'll easily be able to program in any language. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Kaze Emanuar or click the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% of Brilliant's annual premium subscription.